The city was nothing like the village I had left behind. Towering buildings stretched toward the sky, their glass facades reflecting the morning sun in blinding flashes of light. The streets buzzed with life. Cars honking, people rushing past me, and vendors shouting to catch attention. It felt overwhelming yet exhilarating, a place where everything seemed possible. I clutched my small suitcase tighter, reminding myself why I had come here, for a fresh start, an opportunity to build a better life. When I arrived at the Caldwell's elegant suburban home, I couldn't help but feel a pang of awe. Their house stood out even among the other grand homes on the tree-lined street, its white columns gleaming under the sunlight. As I rang the doorbell, my heart raced, not just from excitement, but also from nerves. What if they didn't like me? What if I wasn't good enough? The door opened, and there she was, Sophia Caldwell. She looked every bit as warm and kind as her voice had sounded over the phone during our interview. Her smile was genuine, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You must be Amina," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Welcome, we're so glad to have you." Her words immediately put me at ease. Over the next hour, she gave me a tour of the house, introducing me to the two children, Emma, who was 5, and little Noah, barely 3. They were adorable, their laughter filling the air as they played in the living room. Sophia explained how much she needed help managing the household while juggling her responsibilities outside the home. "I can't tell you how relieved I am that you're here," she confessed, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "It's been chaos without someone to rely on." From that moment, I knew I wanted to do my best for this family. Sophia treated me not just as an employee, but as part of their lives. She confided in me about her struggles balancing work and motherhood, sharing stories that made me admire her strength. In return, I poured all my energy into caring for Emma and Noah, ensuring they felt loved and nurtured. Simon, however, kept his distance. He was often away, working late hours or traveling for business. When he was home, he rarely interacted with me beyond polite greetings, a nod here, a brief good morning there. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, he was busy, and I was simply the nanny. But then I began to notice something odd. The way his gaze would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. It happened subtly, almost imperceptibly. Once, as I tucked Emma into bed, I glanced up to find him standing in the doorway, watching silently. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary before he turned away. Another time, during breakfast, I caught him staring again, his fork paused midway to his mouth. Each instance left me uneasy, though I tried to convince myself it was harmless. Maybe I was imagining things, projecting meaning onto innocent moments because of my own insecurities. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Deep down, I wondered if Simon saw me differently, not just as the nanny, but as something else. The thought unsettled me. I reminded myself constantly of why I was here, to serve this family faithfully, to honor the trust Sophia placed in me. My faith anchored me, guiding my actions and keeping me grounded. Whatever strange tension existed between Simon and me, I resolved to ignore it. This was my new beginning, and I refused to let anything or anyone derail it. For now, I focused on adapting to my new life. I memorized the children's routines, learned which toys brought them joy, and discovered the perfect lullaby to soothe Noah to sleep. Slowly, the Caldwell home began to feel less foreign and more like a sanctuary. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to push aside those lingering doubts about Simon, they remained, whispering quietly in the back of my mind. The days began to blur together in a haze of routine, but something had shifted. It started subtly, Simon lingering just a little longer at the breakfast table, his eyes finding mine as I served coffee or cleared dishes. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence, an overactive imagination fueled by my own loneliness in this sprawling city far from home. But then the compliments came. "You have a real talent for cooking," he said one morning, leaning against the counter while I plated scrambled eggs for the children. His tone was casual, almost playful, yet there was something beneath it. A warmth that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," I replied stiffly, keeping my gaze on the food rather than meeting his eyes. Compliments like these weren't uncommon. Sophia often praised my work too. Yet coming from Simon, they felt different, charged with meaning. I wasn't ready to confront. He began asking questions about me, where I grew up, what life was like back in the village, how I ended up working for their family. Each query seemed innocent enough, but they piled up, creating a closeness I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, after tucking Emma and Noah into bed for their naps, I found him sitting in the living room, flipping through a photo album Sophia had left out. He glanced up when I entered, gesturing toward the pictures. "These are amazing," he said. "They remind me of my childhood. Simple, carefree." I hesitated before joining him, perching awkwardly on the edge of the couch. For the next hour, we talked, not about the kids or household duties, but about ourselves. He shared stories about growing up in a small town much like mine, his voice softening as he described summers spent fishing with his father and winters building snow forts with friends. There was a vulnerability in the way he spoke, a side of him I hadn't seen before. And despite knowing better, I let myself be drawn in. Meanwhile, Sophia continued to confide in me, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her roof. One evening, as we folded laundry together, she sighed heavily, her hands pausing mid-mashmas. "Simon works so much," she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "Sometimes I feel like we're living separate lives." She looked at me, searching for understanding, and all I could do was nod sympathetically. Her words cut deep, stirring guilt I couldn't ignore. Here she was, trusting me implicitly, sharing pieces of her heart, while I harbored feelings I shouldn't, even if only fleetingly, for her husband. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I tried to rationalize everything. Simon's charm disarmed me, yes, but I knew better than to entertain such thoughts. My faith was my anchor, my guiding light, and I prayed fervently for strength to resist whatever pull I felt toward him. Still, the flicker of attraction remained, stubborn and persistent, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. It didn't help that Simon seemed determined to stay close. He'd appear in the kitchen while I prepared meals, offering to help chop vegetables or set the table. On weekends, he'd join us during outings to the park, walking beside me as the children played. Once he even handed me a cup of tea without being asked, brushing his fingers lightly against mine as he passed it over. The touch sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric, and I quickly pulled away, muttering a quiet, "Thank you." Every interaction left me more conflicted. I told myself it was harmless, that Simon was simply being friendly, but the truth was harder to deny. There was a connection forming between us, fragile and unspoken, that terrified me. I thought about leaving, about putting distance between us before things spiraled further. But how could I? Sophia trusted me, the children adored me. Leaving would mean abandoning them, betraying the bond we'd built. And so I stayed, caught between two worlds. The life I'd promised to uphold and the emotions threatening to unravel it. Each day brought new challenges, new moments of doubt. Simon's presence loomed larger in my mind, his laughter echoing long after he'd left the room. Meanwhile, Sophia's confessions weighed heavily on my conscience. Reminders of the pain I might cause if I allowed myself to cross the line. Yet no matter how hard I tried to push him away, Simon kept finding excuses to draw nearer. Whether intentional or not, his actions chipped away at my defenses, leaving me torn between loyalty to Sophia and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. Guilt became my constant companion, whispering harsh truths I couldn't escape. But even amidst the turmoil, one thing was clear. I was standing on shaky ground, and every step forward carried the risk of falling. The rain tapped gently against the windows, a soothing rhythm that filled the quiet house. Sophia had taken the kids to a play date, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and my own thoughts for company. I was tidying up the kitchen, wiping down counters I'd already cleaned twice, when Simon appeared in the doorway. He leaned casually against the frame, his hands shoved into his pockets, watching me with an intensity that made my movements falter. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but steady. Mind if I keep you company? I forced a smile, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened at his presence. Of course not, the more help the better. He stepped inside, pulling out a chair from the table and sitting down. For a while, we talked about trivial things, the weather, the children's antics, recipes I might try next week. But there was something beneath his words, a weight that lingered even as he laughed at one of his own jokes. It wasn't long before the conversation shifted, his tone growing quieter, more deliberate. You ever feel like you're stuck? He asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. His question caught me off guard, and I paused mid-wipe, turning to look at him. Stuck? I echoed, unsure how to respond. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, like, no matter what you do, you can't escape this feeling that life isn't yours anymore, that you're just going through the motions because everyone expects it. His confession startled me, not just the words themselves, but the raw vulnerability in his voice. This wasn't the Simon I'd come to know over the past few weeks. This was someone else entirely, broken, searching, desperate for connection. And yet, despite knowing I should distance myself, I found myself drawn to him. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, I said carefully, setting the cloth aside. But maybe it's about finding meaning in the little things, in the people who depend on us. He looked up then, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that took my breath away. Do you really believe that? Or are you just saying it to make me feel better? His honesty disarmed me, and I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Before I could speak, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I see the way you look at me, Amina. You feel it too, don't you? My heart stopped. My mind screamed at me to deny it, to laugh it off or change the subject, but my body betrayed me. I froze, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from his. The air between us seemed to crackle with unspoken tension, each second stretching longer than the last. When he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against mine, I should have pulled away. I knew I should have, but instead I stayed still, letting his touch linger. It was wrong, so deeply, fundamentally wrong, and yet it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I'm sorry, he murmured, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. I shouldn't have said anything. I needed you to know. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, guilt and longing warring within me. Simon, we can't, I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. This isn't right. I know, he admitted, his expression pained. But pretending I don't feel this way isn't helping either. His words struck a chord deep inside me, resonating with emotions I'd tried so hard to suppress. Faith had always been my anchor, guiding me through moments of doubt and temptation. Yet here I was, standing on shaky ground, torn between everything I believed in and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. Before I could respond, he stood, releasing my hand but stepping closer instead. His proximity sent a shiver down my spine, every nerve in my body acutely aware of him. I won't push you, he said softly, but I also won't lie to you. Or to myself. Anymore. And with that, he left the room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and trembling hands. That single moment, a fleeting touch, a whispered confession, became the catalyst for something I couldn't undo, something forbidden, something dangerous. But even as guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Not yet. The weeks slipped by in a haze of stolen moments and whispered words, each one pulling me deeper into a web I couldn't escape. Simon and I grew closer with every passing day, finding ways to be together when Sophia was occupied, when she took the children to school, when she ran errands, or even during those brief stretches when she retreated to her room for a nap. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Every time our eyes met across the kitchen counter or our hands brushed while reaching for the same dish, I told myself it would be the last time. But then another moment would come, soft and irresistible, and I'd find myself giving in again. Each encounter left me hollowed out, my guilt gnawing at me like an unrelenting storm. At night, after tucking Emma and Noah into bed and ensuring the house was quiet, I'd kneel on the prayer mat in my small room, tears streaming down my face as I begged Allah for forgiveness. Please forgive me, I prayed over and over, my voice trembling. I don't want to feel this way. Help me let go. But no matter how fervently I prayed, the feelings only seemed to deepen, twisting themselves into the fabric of my being until they felt inseparable from who I was. And yet, despite the weight of my guilt, there were moments when I allowed myself to believe that what we shared was real. That maybe Simon saw something in me no one else ever had. He spoke of his loneliness, his longing for connection. And I listened because I understood it all too well. In him, I found someone who looked at me not just as Amina the nanny, but as Amina the person. The thought terrified me, but it also filled a void I hadn't realized existed. But nothing cut through me more sharply than Sophia's trust. She confided in me often now, treating me less like an employee and more like a confidant. One afternoon, as we sat together folding laundry, she looked at me with such sincerity that it made my chest ache. "I trust you, Amina," she said softly, her hands smoothing a shirt before setting it aside. "You've become such a good friend to me." Her words hit me like a knife slicing through my heart. Friend. That's what she thought I was. A friend, not someone sneaking around behind her back, betraying her in the most intimate way possible. My breath caught and I forced a smile, nodding as though her words didn't leave me feeling sick to my stomach. "Thank you, Sophia," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. "That means a lot." Later that evening, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, her words replayed in my mind like a broken record. How could I do this to her? To them? Sophia had welcomed me into her home, treated me with kindness and respect, and here I was repaying her by secretly falling for her husband. The betrayal was unbearable, a heavy chain wrapped around my soul, dragging me further away from the person I wanted to be. Simon noticed the change in me almost immediately. When he approached me later that week in the garden, his expression was concerned. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low so as not to be overheard. "You seem distant." "I can't keep doing this," I blurted out, my voice barely above a whisper. The words spilled out before I could stop them, raw and desperate. "This isn't right, Simon. We're hurting people who trust us." He frowned, stepping closer. "Amina, I know it's complicated, but we can't pretend these feelings don't exist. You mean something to me. Something real." His words should have comforted me, but instead they only deepened my despair. "Feelings aren't enough," I shot back, my voice trembling. "They won't protect Sophia from the pain we'll cause if she finds out. They won't ease the guilt I feel every single day." For a moment, he didn't respond, his gaze searching mine, as if trying to find some glimmer of hope. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then, what do you want me to do? Walk away? Pretend none of this happened?" "Yes!" I cried, though the word felt like ash in my mouth. "No." I shook my head, frustrated with myself. "I don't know, I need space, time to think." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Okay, if that's what you need." But there was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own, a reminder of the bond we'd created, and the destruction it might bring. As he walked away, I sank onto the bench beneath the shade of a tree, pressing my palms to my temples. The weight of everything, the guilt, the conflict, the impossible pull between faith and desire, felt suffocating. For the first time since arriving in the city, I wondered if staying here was worth it. Could I really continue living under this roof, pretending everything was fine while carrying the burden of what I'd done? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and guilt, each moment pulling me in opposing directions. I tried to distance myself from Simon, keeping my interactions with him strictly professional, but he was relentless, finding ways to weave himself into my thoughts even when he wasn't physically present. His voice lingered in my mind, his words echoing like a haunting melody I couldn't silence. "We could be happy together," he had said one evening, his tone soft but fervent, as if he truly believed it. You deserve better than this life." His declaration unsettled me more than I cared to admit. There was something intoxicating about the way he spoke, so sure, so certain, as though he saw a future for us that defied all reason. For fleeting moments, I allowed myself to entertain the idea, what would it feel like to leave everything behind, to start anew with someone who claimed to love me unconditionally? The thought was dangerous, seductive, and utterly forbidden. But then reality crashed back in, sharp and unyielding. How could I ever justify betraying Sophia, who had welcomed me into her home with open arms, who trusted me not only as a nanny, but as a friend? Every glance at her warm smile or every laugh shared over dinner felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my conscience. And yet, Simon's persistence chipped away at my resolve. He didn't shout or demand. Instead, he whispered promises of freedom and fulfillment, planting seeds of doubt where none should have taken root. One afternoon, while the children played outside under Sophia's watchful eye, I found myself alone in the kitchen. My hands trembled as I washed dishes, the water running cold against my skin. It was then that Simon appeared again, leaning casually against the doorway as though he owned the space. And perhaps, in some twisted way, he did. "Amina," he began, his voice low enough that no one else would hear. "You can't keep pretending you don't feel what's between us." His gaze bore into mine, unwavering and intense. "I know you think about it too. About us." My breath hitched and I turned away, scrubbing harder at a plate that was already clean. "There is no us, Simon," I replied, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound firm. "This, whatever this is, it has to stop." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of cologne clinging to him. "Why?" he asked, his tone almost gentle. "Because it's easier to deny how you feel than to face the truth. You're unhappy here, Amina. I see it in your eyes. This isn't the life you dreamed of." His words struck a chord deep within me, stirring doubts I'd buried beneath layers of duty and faith. Was he right? Had I settled for less than I deserved? The questions swirled in my mind, taunting me with their complexity. Before I could respond, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. I flinched, pulling my hand away as though burned. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "don't make this harder than it already is." Simon sighed, stepping back but not retreating entirely. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Amina. I just want you to be honest with yourself, if nothing else." His words stayed with me long after he left the room, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. That night, unable to bear the weight of my thoughts any longer, I picked up the phone and dialed Layla's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Amina, is everything okay?" I hesitated, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "No," I admitted finally, my voice cracking. "Nothing's okay." For the next hour, I poured out my heart to her, recounting every detail. The stolen glances, the late-night conversations, the unbearable tension that seemed to follow me everywhere. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Layla spoke, her tone firm and unyielding. "Amina, you're playing with fire," she said, her words cutting through the chaos in my mind like a blade. "This isn't just about your happiness. It's about your soul. Think about what you're risking. Your faith, your integrity, everything you've worked so hard to build." Her warning hit me like a slap, forcing me to confront the gravity of my situation. She was right, of course. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction or a harmless crush. It was a moral dilemma that threatened to unravel everything I held dear. "But what if he's right?" I countered weakly, hating how desperate I sounded. "What if I am settling for less than I deserve?" Layla's response was immediate and unflinching. "Then find another way to change your life. One that doesn't involve destroying someone else's in the process. Happiness built on lies and betrayal isn't happiness at all. It's poison." Her words reverberated in my chest, heavy and undeniable. As much as I wanted to believe there was an easy solution, Layla reminded me that life rarely offered such luxuries. The path ahead would require sacrifice, courage, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when it felt impossibly hard. When we ended the call, I sat in silence, staring at the wall, as her advice sank in. The road I was on led only to ruin, and continuing down it would cost me far more than I was willing to lose. For the first time in weeks, clarity pierced through the fog of doubt and desire. I knew what I had to do. The garden was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt heavy with unspoken words. The air carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine, and the soft rustle of leaves provided a fragile backdrop to the storm brewing inside me. I had been dreading this moment for days, maybe even weeks, but I knew it couldn't wait any longer. Every stolen glance, every whispered word between Simon and me only deepened the chasm of guilt within me. It had to end now. Simon stood by the rose bushes, his hands shoved into his pockets as he stared at the ground. He looked up when I approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what I needed to say pressed against my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. "This has to stop," I said finally, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. "It's wrong, Simon. I can't keep doing this, not to Sophia and not to myself." He froze, his gaze locking onto mine. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, hurt, disbelief, maybe even anger, but it vanished almost instantly. When he spoke, his tone was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You're really gonna do this?" he asked, his voice low but laced with accusation. "After everything, you're just gonna walk away?" "I have to," I replied, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. "Don't you see? This isn't who we are. We're hurting people we care about, people who trust us." His jaw tightened and he took a step closer, his movements deliberate. "And what about what I feel? Did you ever think about that? You knew how I felt about you. You've always known." His words hit me like a slap, forcing me to take a step back. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the truth I'd tried so desperately to bury. Yes, I had known. From the way he looked at me, from the way his touch lingered just a little too long, I had known. But hearing him say it aloud made it impossible to deny anymore. "Don't act like you didn't want this too," he continued, his voice rising now, tinged with frustration. "You can't sit there and tell me you didn't feel it, that you don't still feel it." I clenched my fists, fighting to keep my composure. His accusations stung because they were true. At least partly. I had wanted it. In those fleeting moments when the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us, I had let myself believe we could exist outside the boundaries of right and wrong. But reality wasn't so forgiving. "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I did want it. But not like this. Not at this cost." Simon shook his head, his expression darkening. "So that's it? You get to decide what's worth it and what isn't? What gives you the right to play with my feelings like this?" "I'm not playing with you," I shot back, my own anger bubbling to the surface. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I don't hate myself for letting it go this far? I came here to make things right. For Sophia, for your family, for us. But none of this is right, Simon. None of it." For a moment, he didn't respond. He just stood there, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, his eyes searching mine as if trying to find some trace of the connection we'd shared. But all I could see was the pain I'd caused, the cracks in the foundation of trust that I had helped create. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "If you're so sure this is the right thing to do, then why does it feel like you're ripping something apart that was never broken?" His question caught me off guard, striking a chord deep within me. Was he right? Had I convinced myself that ending things was the noble choice simply because it was the safer one? Or was I truly doing the right thing for everyone involved? "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "All I know is that we can't keep living like this. We're not just risking our own lives, we're destroying the people around us, and I won't be responsible for that. Simon sighed, running a hand through his hair. The anger in his eyes softened, replaced by a sadness that mirrored my own. Fine, he said after a long pause, his tone resigned. If this is what you want, then I'll respect it. But don't expect me to forget what we had, or to stop feeling the way I do. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I wanted to tell him that time would heal the wounds we'd inflicted on ourselves, that distance would dull the ache of longing. But even as I opened my mouth to speak, I realized I didn't believe it. Not completely. Some scars ran too deep to fade entirely. Instead, I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Thank you, I murmured, though the gratitude felt misplaced. For understanding. He gave a small, bitter laugh, shaking his head. I don't understand, Amina. Not really. But I guess that doesn't matter anymore. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the garden. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the grass, but the beauty of the scene felt cruelly ironic. My hands trembled as I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold together the pieces of a life I wasn't sure I could salvage. As the sound of Simon's footsteps faded into the distance, I sank onto a nearby bench, tears streaming down my face. Ending things hadn't brought the relief I'd hoped for, it only magnified the emptiness inside me. I had done the right thing, hadn't I? So, why did it feel like I'd lost a part of myself in the process? And the questions swirled in my mind, unanswered and unanswerable. All I could do was sit there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the garden, and wonder if I would ever find peace again. The night was endless, a suffocating expanse of silence broken only by the faint hum of the city outside my window. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. Every decision I'd made since coming to this house replayed in vivid detail. The stolen glances, the whispered conversations, the way Simon's presence had slowly unraveled me. Each memory felt like a thread pulling apart the fabric of who I once was, leaving behind something frayed and unrecognizable. I thought about Sophia, her kindness, her trust. She had welcomed me into her home as more than just an employee. She had treated me like family. And how had I repaid her? By betraying that trust in the worst possible way. The guilt pressed down on me, heavier than ever before. But it wasn't just guilt over what I'd done to Sophia. It was guilt over what I'd done to myself. How far I'd strayed from the person I wanted to be. As the hours dragged on, I began to see things more clearly. My feelings for Simon weren't rooted in love or even attraction. Not really. They were born out of loneliness, a desperate craving for validation that I hadn't realized I was starving for until he offered it. He saw me when no one else did, or so I told myself. But now, lying there in the dark, I understood the truth. I had used him as much as he had used me. We were two people clinging to each other because we didn't know how to stand alone. And yet, none of that excused what I'd done. No amount of rationalization could erase the pain I would cause if Sophia ever found out. Worse still, I had compromised my own values, the principles I had sworn to live by. Faith, integrity, honesty, these weren't just words to me. They were the foundation of everything I believed in. And here I was, crumbling under their weight. By the time dawn broke, pale light seeping through the curtains, I knew what I had to do. Staying here wasn't an option. This house, these people, they deserved better than someone like me. Someone who couldn't resist temptation, who let her own desires blind her to the consequences of her actions. Leaving wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't undo the hurt I'd caused, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild, to find myself again. I rose quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and sat at the small desk in my room. Pulling out a sheet of paper, I stared at it for a long moment, trying to gather my thoughts. How could I possibly put into words everything I needed to say? How could I apologize without revealing the depth of my betrayal? In the end, I decided simplicity was best. Sophia didn't need to know the specifics. What she needed was closure and maybe forgiveness, though I doubted I deserved it. greater than dear Sophia, greater than, greater than. Thank you for everything you've done for me. You've been more than just a boss to me. You've been a friend, a mentor, and someone I deeply admire. But sometimes life takes us down paths we never intended to walk, and I've come to realize that staying here is no longer the right choice. For me or for your family. Greater than. Greater than, please know that I am truly sorry for any pain I may have caused. Your trust has meant the world to me, and I regret that I haven't always been worthy of it. Thank you for believing in me, even when I struggled to believe in myself. Greater than, greater than. It's time for me to move on, to find a new direction. I hope you can understand, and I hope one day you'll forgive me. Greater than, greater than. With gratitude and respect, Amina tears blurred the ink as I folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter where Sophia would surely find it. I packed my belongings quickly, stuffing clothes and books into a suitcase with trembling hands. The children were still asleep when I slipped out of the house, their laughter from yesterday echoing in my mind like a cruel reminder of what I was leaving behind. The streets were quiet as I walked away, the cool morning air brushing against my skin. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. Not happiness, not relief, but something quieter, something steadier. I didn't know where I was going or what came next, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay where I was, not anymore. As I turned the corner, putting distance between myself and the Caldwell household, I whispered a silent prayer. Not for forgiveness, that would take time, but for strength. Strength to face whatever lay ahead. Strength to become the person I wanted to be, not the person I had allowed myself to become. For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that I could rebuild. Hopeful that I could heal. And hopeful that someday I might look back on this moment not as the end of something, but as the beginning. The bus ride to my hometown felt like a journey through time as much as space. The familiar landscapes rolled by, the fields dotted with wildflowers, the old church steeple rising against the horizon, and the quiet streets where I had once played as a child. It wasn't just nostalgia that pulled at me. It was the hope of finding something I'd lost along the way. Myself. When I stepped off the bus, the air smelled different. Cleaner. Simpler. My mother greeted me at the station with open arms, her embrace warm but tinged with concern. She didn't ask questions, not right away. Instead, she held me close, murmuring words of comfort that made tears well up in my eyes. "You're home now," she said softly, and for the first time in months, those words felt true. I spent the first few days settling back into the rhythm of small-town life. The mornings began early, with sunlight streaming through lace curtains and birdsong filling the silence. I attended prayer services at the mosque, seeking solace in rituals that had once been second nature but now felt foreign after so long away. Kneeling on the prayer mat, I poured out my heart to God, begging for forgiveness and guidance. Each whispered plea was an acknowledgement of how far I'd strayed and a promise to do better. Community service became my anchor. At first, it was a way to distract myself from the storm inside me, but as weeks turned into months, it grew into something more meaningful. Helping others gave me purpose, grounding me when guilt threatened to pull me under. Whether it was tutoring children after school or volunteering at the local food pantry, every act of kindness chipped away at the shame I carried. People smiled at me, thanked me, and slowly I began to believe I might deserve their gratitude. Still, there were nights when the weight of what I'd done pressed down on me like a leaden blanket. Memories of Simon lingered in the corners of my mind, surfacing unbidden during quiet moments. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations and wondering if I could have handled things differently. Could I have been stronger, smarter, more resolute? These thoughts haunted me, but they also reminded me why I'd left. To protect not only Sophia and her family, but also my own soul. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Layla called. Her voice was gentle yet probing, the way it always was when she knew I needed to talk. We hadn't spoken much since I moved back, though she checked in regularly, sending messages of encouragement and reminders to take things one day at a time. "How are you holding up?" she asked after exchanging pleasantries. "I'm okay," I replied, hesitating before adding, "Better than I was." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Layla said, "Tell me what's really going on. Amina, no sugarcoating." Her directness caught me off guard, but I appreciated it. Taking a deep breath, I confessed, "I still think about him sometimes. About everything that happened. It's like this shadow follows me everywhere, reminding me of what I almost let happen." "And what do you tell yourself when those thoughts come?" Layla prompted. "That I chose to walk away," I admitted. "That no matter how weak I felt in the moment, I found the strength to leave before it destroyed me and others." Layla sighed, and I could picture her nodding thoughtfully. "That's huge, Amina. You faced your weakness head on and made the right decision. Not everyone has the courage to do that." "But I shouldn't have been in that position in the first place," I countered, frustration creeping into my voice. "I thought I was strong enough to handle temptation. I thought I could navigate those feelings without letting them consume me, but I couldn't." "Maybe that's okay," Layla said gently. "Maybe being strong isn't about never falling. It's about knowing how to get back up when you do. You fell, Amina, but look at you now. Look at how far you've come." Her words struck a chord deep within me. For so long, I'd been punishing myself for failing, for succumbing to doubt and desire. But maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and moving forward with grace. As we talked, I realized something else. I wasn't alone. Layla's unwavering support, my mother's quiet understanding, and even the kindness of strangers in my community, they were all threads weaving together a safety net that kept me from falling too far. I had leaned on them, perhaps unconsciously, and they had held me steady. By the time we ended the call, I felt lighter, as if a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. The scars of my experience would always remain, etched into my memory like lines on a map marking where I'd been, but they didn't define me anymore. They were reminders, not of failure, but of resilience. In the weeks that followed, I continued rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I reconnected with old friends, joined a book club at the library, and even started teaching Sunday school at the mosque. Each new connection brought a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. Slowly, the ache of regret began to fade, replaced by a quiet peace. One crisp autumn morning, as I walked through the park near my childhood home, I paused beneath a towering oak tree. Its leaves shimmered gold in the sunlight, and for a moment, I felt completely at ease. I thought about the lessons I'd learned, the importance of staying true to myself, even when the world seemed determined to pull me in another direction. Temptation would always exist, I realized, but so would the strength to resist it. As I stood there, watching the wind scatter leaves across the path, I whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for the mistakes that taught me humility, for the people who helped me heal, and for the faith that guided me home. Though the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, I knew I was ready to face it, not because I believed I was invincible, but because I finally understood that strength wasn't about never faltering. It was about choosing to rise again, no matter how many times I stumbled. Amina's journey taught her that human emotions are messy, unpredictable, and often contradictory. She realized how easy it was to justify wrong choices in the name of fleeting desire, but also discovered the quiet strength required to choose honesty, even when it hurt. Through sleepless nights and hard-won clarity, she learned that true courage lies not in following one's impulses, but in staying true to one's values, no matter the cost. In walking away from temptation, Amina found a deeper sense of self-respect and peace, proving that while the heart may wander, integrity can guide us home.